Alrighty. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our last session of our medical school admissions series for this summer. I am honored to be with Dr. Lindia Willies-Jacobo today. But to introduce myself, I'm Dina Abul Hassan. I'm one of the co-presidents of NAAMA NextGen National, and I will be moderating today's session. So we'll just talk a little bit about NAAMA NextGen before we get into today's event. But as you all know, NAAMA NextGen, we are the student branch of NAAMA, and our goal is to bring together Arab American healthcare students and support them in their career goals and career development. And in doing so, we've established over 50 chapters across the nation and over 1,250 members at this moment, which is very exciting. And we have 6 chapters in the state of California alone. And some high-level things that we do at the national level, we hosted our annual summit last year in Ann Arbor, where we even had a day for just research. Also, a lot of our students are really involved in global health research, where we've done some studies in Lebanon and in Egypt, and also Syria and Jordan. And in that light, we even launched an internship where some of our members are able to go to Lebanon and serve on the ground in some NGO clinics and their local hospitals. Unfortunately, this summer it's going to be postponed, but we're hoping in the future we'll have more and more students being able to go to Lebanon. We also have launched a podcast in February. Shout out to Neil, who's on our call. He is doing amazing with leading the Voices from the Field podcast. Recently, there was an episode uploaded this past Tuesday, so check it out if you haven't done so yet. It's on YouTube and Spotify and Apple Music. And then also, our goal at the national level is to connect with the chapters and helping chapters host local events such as mentorship events and other networking. So save the date. We have our upcoming 7th National Summit this Saturday, not this Saturday, but on Saturday, October 3rd, at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. We'll be releasing registration shortly in the next month, so be on the lookout for your emails and our Instagram about that. And I want to just highlight all 6 of our NAAMA NextGen chapters in California. We have 5 undergrad chapters and 1 medical school chapter, and we're hoping to expand in Kaiser Permanente as well. I was just telling Dr. Willies-Jacobo we're already in that process of onboarding a chapter there. So if anyone ends up going to KPSOM, there'll be a home for you guys as well. But these are just some events that they've done and a lot of collaboration events as well, which has been really great to see. So I just want to get started and let me just stop sharing my screen. But I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Lindia Willies-Jacobo, who is the Senior Associate Dean for Admissions and the Senior Associate Dean for Inclusive Excellence at the Kaiser Permanente Bernard J. Tyson School of Medicine. Dr. Willies-Jacobo oversees the admissions process at KPSOM and is also nationally recognized for her leadership in medical education, healthcare workforce diversity, and health equity. Prior to joining KPSOM, she served at the UC San Diego School of Medicine, where she led diversity and community partnership initiatives for over a decade. And I'm so honored to have her join us today to share her insights on the medical school admissions process. I recently had went through it, so I understand, the struggles that it takes. So without further ado, thank you so much, Dr. Willies-Jacobo, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dina. What an incredibly kind introduction. And I must say, such an impressive organization. I had read up a little bit about it in advance of this session, but just seeing you all in action and all of the amazing work and learning from you, Dina, that this has been ongoing since 2018. So incredibly, incredibly impressive. So I personally could not feel more honored to be here. So thanks so much for the invitation and thanks for having me. I look forward to engaging with all of you over the next hour or so. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to double check. It is recording, correct?
Yes, I see the
Perfect.
red button.
Alrighty. We're just gonna jump right in. So this first question is quite a loaded question, but we see that KPSOM receives over 11,000 applications a year, and there's roughly around 50 spots. So at that level of selectivity, what have you seen usually separates that top 0.5% from that top 2%? Is it their story, how they align with the mission, maybe their clinical experience, or any other qualities you tend to see that stand out in your accepted applicants?
I think that's an incredible question, and I'm happy that you all are aware of, kind of the number of applications we've received. I think for any med school you're applying to, it's kind of nice to get a sense of how many folks are applying, how many folks are interviewing, et cetera. And we have gotten to the point over the last 7 years where our numbers have decreased, which is natural. I think the 10, 11,000 the first 2 years we were open. There was just so much excitement and enthusiasm about the institution. And I think that continues to be the case. But like any new school, over time we do plateau. So we now get close to 7,000 applications, which is still a pretty significant number of applications for 50 spots. So in terms of how we think about the admissions process, and it really is through a mission aligned lens, and we read through every application and we really want to know the story. So when you pose the question, Dana, about is it the story, is it, something else? I think it's everything together, and some of the pieces of the story, for those of you who will soon be applying, it's really having clarity in terms of why you're making the choice to go to medical school. I think for those of us who've already done it, Dina, you are well on your way to beginning. It's a lot of time, it's a lot of effort, and it's a lot of sacrifice. So I would say when we read applications, we want there to be clarity in why you're choosing to become a physician versus something else. There are many other career paths which are wonderful and quite fulfilling. So I think clarity is a standout. We read the application through the lens of understanding the first time students decided they wanted to be physicians, and sort of the experiences they've brought with them throughout the journey, but ensuring that it is in fact aligned with the mission of the school. There are many, many, many talented students. Our pool is loaded with talent. That is not the issue, but we're looking for not just really good students, but good students who have done stuff, right? Who have demonstrated leadership, who have demonstrated a true commitment to service, who have at least begun to think about the concept of advancing equity in health. And then there are metrics, and we can talk through some of that a little bit more. And in terms of the metrics, we often will look and put it together with the story so that we understand the start you all have had in life and through the entirety of your journey, and also get a sense through the lens of your MCAT and your GPA whether you have the readiness for the rigors of medical school. So I think it's the students who have best been able to demonstrate that who then make it to the next level of the journey. And one last thing before I stop, but applying to med school often will feel big, right? It's kind of the entire year from the time you submit your application to the time you interview to the time you get selected to go to whichever med school or med schools. And, you know, I think taking it in small chunks will be important. So I will often tell students who I mentor that when you apply to medical school, your next kind of desired outcome is you want to get that interview, right? Because I do believe truly and strongly that anybody who interviews at a medical school can potentially get into that medical school, because the folks who've read your application have already decided that they think you have what it takes to succeed in their medical school.
Definitely. And after doing some research on Kaiser, that
Hmm.
really emphasizes that multidimensional portrait that
Yeah.
is promoted. And I'm glad that still holds true. They're considering everything from your GPA, MCAT, and also your
Hmm.
experiences. So getting more in the nitty-gritty of the application itself, getting that interview, what have you seen distinguishes a strong and memorable personal statement from an average one?
Yeah, great question. And I didn't think I would say this, but the thing I will say is, I think there's currently a temptation to utilize generative AI. I feel like over the years, the kinds of essays we've read, it's definitely felt supported through that tool. And it's not that you can't use it to generate ideas, but certainly do resist the temptation to utilize it to generate your essay. So I'll just start there. But I think in terms of essays that stand out, and I'm going to come back to one of the very first words that I used is clarity. And I think students who can provide us with their journey in that, kind of amount of, characters that you're allowed, meaning that you you have been able to convince us that this is something that may not necessarily have been a light bulb moment. I don't think there are a lot of light bulb moments for students deciding to go to medical school. I think yeah, I've done this for a long time. And I think for many students, if not most students, it really is a series of life events often. So I think being able to articulate that in sort of a fairly simple way, coupled with some of the experiences, and granted, you're going to list those experiences in a separate area on your application, but some of the experiences that you have used to confirm your interest and your desire to be a doctor should be included in your personal narrative. I often get asked whether students have to commit to a specialty by the end, at the end, in the end of their essay, et cetera. And I say no. We are more interested in the kind of doctor you envision yourself being. We're also interested in learning about some of the skills you've developed over the years. And so those are the areas that I would say students who've been able to kind of thread that needle and put it all together so that by the end of having read an essay, I want to be able to, and not just me, but my team and our faculty need to be able to read it through and say, wow, there's something about how this student constructed this that absolutely convinces me that they're passionate, and that they have thought about this for a while, and that they really, really want to do this. One last thing I'll comment on before I stop is I will often, I mentor a lot of students every cycle over the years, and one of the questions I get asked a lot, especially from students who may have parents or family members who are physicians, whether they should refrain from talking about that. And I don't think you have to refrain from talking about that. But when you talk about it, you still need to ensure that the person reading your application, your portfolio, your essay still recognizes that this is your decision, that you've made the decision. Obviously, if you've had exposure to family members who've been in healthcare, that often can be a motivator. But it shouldn't just be that. It should be demonstrating some level of reflection that you have thought about this as your own story. I hope that that sort of makes sense.
Definitely. And would you say this is similar to how students should structure their activities? Should it be more narrative, or should it just be like, these are the skills that I gained or learned?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're talking, Dina, about when you list your 15 or so
Correct.
experiences. Yeah. So usually it's a very brief narrative, but especially for the three most meaningful experiences, not that we don't look at the other experiences, we're looking at the entirety of the application. But for those three most meaningful experiences, it's especially important to really speak into what about the experience made it meaningful. So, for example, if you list, a community-based organization that, you have worked with and maybe you've had some leadership roles, et cetera, right? If you are part, obviously, you're all a part of this organization. And if that's something you list as most meaningful, I think it's going to be important then for you to articulate what areas, what aspects about it are the most meaningful to you through the lens of course, going to medical school. So,
hmm And I want to segue a little bit into secondaries.
mhm,
How would you say, how much does the secondaries weigh relative to the primaries? And what
yeah.
are some either red flags or mistakes that you see applicants making in that secondary responses phase?
Yeah, thanks for that. So, secondary applications are extremely important. And they're extremely important because most medical schools, I would venture to say all medical schools, construct their secondary applications so that they can really get a sense of how mission aligned a candidate is. All right. And so I'll just say on our application, I think we have 5 essays. So essays vary in length. Some schools will ask you 2 questions, some will ask you 10. So it really just depends on the institution, but the questions are all going to be designed based on a school's mission, vision, and core values. So they're really important because that's kind of where, a lot of the early decision making in the cycle is right is made. In terms of some of the areas that I've seen students maybe trip up on a little bit, when you all are thematically, even though the questions are going to be different from school to school, there may be thematically some areas that are very similar, right? And so I often tell students, please beware of copy and paste. We sometimes will get responses for Stanford, uh, right, school. And, so just be really mindful if you're doing any level of copying. I do a workshop for another organization on writing the secondary applications. And that's one of the things I point out as, just being cautious about, because it's really easy to do, especially if you're very busy and you're trying to just get all these secondaries out. So just ensure that if you're copying and pasting some of the thematic pieces from one narrative to another, that you read through it. The other thing is grammatical errors. It may seem kind of minor, but when you're reading through a bunch of applications, if folks are seeing a fair amount of grammatical errors, I think it then becomes a little bit tedious for the person reading it. And then the last pitfall that I would say we sometimes will see is students are not really answering the prompt. So do try to the best of your ability, ensure that you are reading the prompt carefully so that as you're constructing your response, right, you really are responding to the prompt you're being asked.
Definitely. And would you
Mm,
say for secondaries, it's important for students to reference maybe specific things about the school or programs, even if it's not
yeah.
explicitly asked about?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. You're not going, your application will not be cast aside if you're not doing that. But I think it shows another level of inquiry that you've done about the institution, that you've at least gone to the website or you've gone to the MSAR, the AAMC MSAR site, that maybe you've had the opportunity to speak to some students if you know anyone at that particular med school. So yeah, I think to the extent that you have a sense of perhaps work that a particular faculty member does. You all may know that our school has a health system science department, for example, and sometimes on, one of our specific secondary application questions, folks will speak into, perhaps some of the work that department is responsible for. And, there are times people will even look up the faculty who work in those spaces and get a sense of the kinds of research or other kinds of work that particular faculty does. So, not by any means absolutely mandatory, but is a good idea, to at least demonstrate that you know something about the institution.
Yes, and now I want to talk a little bit about the interview process.
Mhm,
I know at Kaiser, looking at previous cycles, KPSOM interviews around 700 applicants
mhm,
cycle.
mhm.
which is
Hmm.
quite a lot, especially for
Hmm.
a school that doesn't have as many seats. So kind of what does that process look like? How are applicants assessed in their interview versus their primary and secondaries? And how do they just screen out those candidates?
Yeah. So we have the way we've divided up our processes. We have faculty who do file reviews. It's a separate group who conduct the interviews. And we have a lot of interviewers because our process is so resource intensive. It is MMI and a traditional interview. And so it's really how it's the reason we have an MMI portion is we wanted to ensure, and many schools utilize MMI, and I would say more utilized it before the pandemic. I feel like we all existed in this pre and post pandemic world, and many schools went away from it because it's harder to structure MMI in a virtual space. But we've managed to do it. So we really keep our interviews as standardized as we can. We have rubrics that our interviewers will assess candidates on. They've all been instructed to ensure that they're more listening to what the candidate is saying, especially in a virtual space. You can't really assess people all that well on eye contact. I'm sure I'm not looking at all of you because I can't keep my eye on my camera. So I think a lot of the areas that the behavioral kinds of pieces that we tend to be able to pick up on pretty quickly if one's conducting an in-person interview is a little bit harder to do in a virtual space. But we really are ensuring that we are providing students, again, with questions that are aligned to the mission of the school. So it's yet another opportunity to demonstrate your mission alignment with the institution. So, ensure that you're showing up dressed in a professional way, ensure that you are, you've thought through for those 2 minutes that you're reading the prompt, that you're really getting clarity in terms of what the prompt is asking. You can take notes, and so students can refer to those notes. But really ensuring that we then have an understanding that lots of the kinds of things we're asking in the questions you've in some way thought about. You in the traditional interview, it usually is a time when students can just more speak into their life journey. So that's one of the reasons we've added that or kept the traditional interview component, because that's where we tend to learn a lot more about the candidate. So we have that standardized portion, then we have and then we still have a traditional kind of interview.
Gotcha. I really like how,
Mhm.
mission aligned Kaiser is, especially in the whole process, it seems like.
Mhm.
So I want to
Mhm.
kind of look at this big picture now. This
Mhm.
session is the only session we're doing West Coast schools. So
Oh
I wanted to
wow.
get some insight. California has
Yeah.
so many med schools, UCLA, UCSD, and now Kaiser. What gap would you say in the medical education landscape was Kaiser specifically built to fill that, maybe these schools weren't addressing?
Yeah, I love that question. I think a couple things, and one is just understanding how we were funded from the beginning, and it is by Kaiser Permanente. Our Kaiser Foundation's been gracious, and some days I wake up, I can't imagine, we and our students have the amount of support that we have. But I would say that Kaiser had been in the medical education space for quite some time, primarily in what's called graduate medical education, meaning residency training. So that's something they've done for a while. They've also, because the organization is so big, they've historically had students from UCLA and other institutions rotating through, through their hospitals and clinics, et cetera. And I think some of the gaps that, and this is not unique to any specific school, but I think just medical education across the board. Um, I think truly thinking about how we engage in competency based medical education. So, a lot of how our systems are currently structured is, you know, everyone at the school who engages with students, and I'm speaking specifically about faculty, are really here to teach, right? We don't have wet labs. I mean, the research that comes out of our institution, it's either clinically based or it's medical education based. And so the core of teaching and learning was definitely has historically and continues to be a significant focus at the school. Also recognizing the changing landscape of healthcare, of medicine, with the, really quite aggressive, arrival of artificial intelligence, we knew that we would have the distinct opportunity to think critically about innovation and technology. And so I think these were areas, and based on our size, 50 students a year, at the max, we're at 200 students, right? So we knew we could really borrow best practices from a bunch of different institutions. We were very lucky to have had gracious partners as we were constructing our own curriculum, and then having the opportunity to say, what if with all of those pieces we really thought about pedagogically what that could look like, and hence the small group learning. And many of you are likely aware that we don't have lectures at the school. All of our teaching and learning happens in small groups where we can more keenly truly evaluate students based on competency, which means we're trying to assess students based on outcomes, on how they're progressing in their learning. So I think those were some of the areas that when we constructed the school, that those were the areas we were paying keen attention to. And then the last thing I will say, and I alluded to it earlier, with us having a health system science department, and though some other institutions now have one, we were the first health systems or HSS department in the country, which has been tremendous because it then also allowed us to ensure that our students had a deep understanding of population health and of epidemiology. And, all of that then plays into ensuring that when our students graduate and go on to residency training, that they really, really had a deep understanding of the influence and the impact that everything that happens outside the clinical spaces, that the impact it has on families and on their well-being. So I hope that's helpful in terms of trying to think about how we fit into the 13, 14, 15 California schools. So.
Yeah, it's so interesting that transformation from like residency only to having,
Hmm.
medical school class, and
Right,
just
right.
seeing that is really nice,
Hmm.
to expand in that way.
Yeah.
And just with one last question, and we have plenty of
Hmm.
time for open
Yeah,
Q&A.
sure.
What is one thing you wish more applicants and pre-med students understood or focused more on when preparing to apply to medical school and specifically KPSOM?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think just in general, I would say recognizing that you're going to get a lot of advice, probably a lot that's unsolicited. And, if you go onto studentdoctor.net, there's just a lot of information. Some days I read all the stuff out there and I get anxious, and I've been a doctor for a really long time. So I think just recognizing that, especially from a timing perspective, I sometimes connect with students who really, really think, it's like I've got to get there, next year or the next year. And if that's the case, that's the case, but not being afraid to slow things down a little bit until you're feeling fully ready. Like, I wish someone had told me that. I went to medical school in 1988, and I went directly from undergrad to med school. And that has changed, right? 60, 70% of students are taking a gap or a growth year, right? And so, not being fearful of taking a little bit of time from the time you graduate from college, if that's your desire. If you want to go straight through, I think that's great. I think, though, there's sometimes this fear of, if I wait 2 years and, but I give yourself the time and the space to do that and to have other experiences if that's something that you want to do. So I guess I'm simply saying it really should be on kind of your timeline rather than all of the external stuff that can come into play at times. And then about our school specifically, I really want students to reflect and think about how how you learn and really reflect on and we know none of us learn in one specific way. We know that it's multimodal, but think deeply about your learning preferences is how we're thinking about this now, because I think otherwise you may end up, in a school that has no lectures, that's really quite tiny, and you're like, well, where's the campus? And it's like, we actually don't have one, So I think deeply about any school you're applying to, and certainly our school. Some of the things I remind, it's a wonderful place, no regrets. I've been here for 7 years now. I was at UC San Diego School of Medicine for 30 years before I came here. I did everything, 30 some years actually. I went to undergrad, med school, pediatrics residency, chief residency, faculty, worked at, was a dean, all of that. Everything was at UC San Diego. So very different institution, wonderful institution, but very, I have no regrets. We had 550 students here. Max, we have 200 students max. So it's all very different. So just do know that, KP is a small, intimate community, and I certainly love being here. I think the students who've chosen to be here love it as well. But you have to love a smaller environment. You have to not yearn for a university campus because, again, we're in an integrated health system. And we have done some partnering with other, kind of local medical schools so that some of our student organizations, for example, have done some partnering outside of the school. So I think those would simply be important, elements to think about as you're applying.
That is also helpful. I second everything that you said for sure. Well, thank you so much for answering all these questions. I want to open it up now to our audience. Feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, and or put in the chat, and we can read it out loud.
No questions.
I also have more questions if
Oh, okay. Dina is prepared.
Go ahead, Ryan.
I thank you so much for speaking with us, Doctor. I really appreciate it. I had a question for out-of-state residents. I know that Kaiser has primarily in-state residents as accepted students. What can an out-of-state student who's applying do to show their interest in going to a school like Kaiser, and like kind of their commitment to
Yeah.
being in a school out of their state?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Ryan. Thanks for the question. And, we are one of these schools that we don't have a California preference. I think the first couple years we were 50-50-ish. And then over time, it seemed like we had more and more and more California applicants. I think California has some of the highest rate of pre-med, or I believe, in the country. So the point is that we look at every application, whether you're in state or out of state. I think what ends up happening is, as you probably know, when people make those final decisions, a lot of folks like to be closer to wherever it is they grew up. And we historically have such a large number of California residents, but your application will be assessed exactly like any other resident. We have no residency preference, but thank you so much for
Okay,
that.
thank you so much. It's great to.
Absolutely.
That is
Absolutely.
great news for some Michigan attendees.
Yes, indeed. Come on, Michigan. Yeah.
Go ahead, Neil.
Thank you so much for joining us and answering all of our questions.
Mhm.
Something that, although I've been through this process, just something that I'm really curious about is letters of recommendation. We
Yeah.
often hear that some letters of recommendation might maybe, I don't want to say hurt you, but if they're generic, they're not really going to help you. I really wanted to ask about that.
Mm,
Have you seen
yeah.
instances where actually having a letter of recommendation has hurt an applicant just because it didn't stand out?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And for our school, we accept 3 to 6 letters, and we also, in lieu of the 3 to 6 letters, we also take on pre-health advisory committee kinds of letters, which are typically quite comprehensive. But I agree with you wholeheartedly, Neil. I think students are often tempted to go to professors at their school
Hmm.
who are like well-known researchers or what have you. And I say to the students often that that's only helpful if they really know you,
Hmm.
right? So I do think that we sometimes overdo kind of the prestige of the name sort of thing. And the prestige of the name is great if that person also knows who Neil is and can say things about you that are helpful to the admissions committee, the file reviewers, and your interviewers. In terms of have I seen letters that hurt? The first letter that, and not that it's going to hurt, but it's not helpful. So I'll just
Hmm.
use past example, not from KP, but when I was doing admissions at UCSD, there was one professor in particular who would always write 4 to 5 sentences for the letter, and all they would note is the row in their class the student would sit in,
Hmm.
and sort of there was an absurdity to it, and
Hmm.
sort of always wore a red plaid shirt. Like that was kind of a classic kind of letter. So that letter is not going to hurt the student. It wouldn't hurt you, but it's not helping you. And so I
Hmm.
think people just started to just disregard those letters anyway. And thankfully, there were other letters that could say more about the student. The letters that can hurt candidates, and most students will waive their right to see their letters, and so you wouldn't know this, and hence it's important to be careful with who you ask for letters from. If you've worked in a laboratory and you may have had maybe not the most positive experience, and you're not quite certain how the PI perceived you. I think those are all risky kinds of letters. Does that
Hmm.
kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Um, and the times I've seen letters, and it's not frequent, thankfully, it's a very infrequent occurrence, right? And it always pains me because I cannot say that to a candidate, right? So there can be letters where people write things like, was often late to the lab, didn't get along with lab members, couldn't interpret their experiments. So even if you have 6 letters or 5 letters and one says that and 4 are okay, there might be a fixation on that one where people are at
Yeah.
least wondering, like, was that was that a fluke, or did the student not know they were told they were late? So it can get complicated because I do think that students are well meaning in trying to get letters from people with whom you've worked. And I'm not suggesting that you need to like censure people with whom, but I think just be mindful because you're likely not going to know what's in those letters. I
Oh,
hope I
thank
hope
you.
that makes sense to people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it definitely does. Thank you so much for
And
the
I've
answer.
become, as
Yeah.
someone who writes a lot of letters, I will be honest, I'm frustrated by those letters because I have had people ask for letters and I know I can't write a strong letter. And so, but I'm very upfront about
Hmm.
that. And again, that is not a frequent occurrence. That's very infrequent, right? I can literally count the number of times that's happened. But I would not write a letter that would hurt a candidate. I would not do that. But you know, I think folks feel a bit differently, and so I hope that clarifies, Neil, for you and for others who may have kind of similar wonderings about letters of recommendation.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely, you're welcome, Neil.
We have a question in the chat from Tamara. How do you guys view applicants that work within Kaiser in other positions already? Does this help show that they align with your mission more since you're already working in your mission?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it could help you if you are working in ways, again, that's kind of mission aligned with the school's mission. And again, the school's mission is very much aligned. It's not identical, but very much aligned with the larger organization. And the other thing, Tamara, I would say about your question is it is nice if you've worked within the Kaiser Permanente system that you then get a letter from the person with whom you've worked, assuming that you've worked for an extensive amount of time, whereby they will be comfortable providing that letter. I hope that's helpful.
Does anyone have any other questions?
I have a follow-up to my earlier question, but I just didn't want to take away space from any. You can go ahead, Rana, if we have time after I can ask mine.
Okay, quick question. So I've heard of this issue happening here a lot, at my school. Somebody got a letter of rec from a professor, and that professor ended up getting fired. Would the letter
Oh,
hurt them, or should they still use the letter?
I think that's a really great question. There's just so much bureaucracy around a faculty member getting fired. That's not going to hurt the candidate. The candidate had absolutely nothing to do with whatever the issues were, right? So great, great question. But yeah, rest assured that that would have no impact. And I've seen that happen, right? Where, folks read it and sometimes a committee member may know the faculty and go, oh my gosh, that faculty member is no longer there or what have you. But they wrote them a great letter, right? So that's not in any way going to hurt the candidate.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Neil, feel free to ask your follow-up.
Yeah, it's not really a follow-up, actually. It's more of a completely different question. But this, very clearly, this is NAAMA NextGen. It's an organization with like an ethno-linguistic label tied to it. And I feel that,
Uh-huh.
to a lot of people, their Arab American identity is very important. Um,
Yes.
Yet at the same time, right now we're at like, I would say a watershed moment in terms of affirmative action. And
Yes.
California itself has, I think it's like 1990s was one of the first states to really get rid of affirmative action.
Yeah,
You know,
1995, 96. I
yes.
remember that moment quite
Yeah.
vividly. Yeah, yeah.
Because Michigan followed suit shortly
Yeah,
after. And
boy,
yeah.
do I remember that. Yes,
Yeah.
indeed. Uh-huh.
And I'm just curious about, although, of course, someone's ethnic identity or those kind of experiences relating to that aren't taken into account, how can students still, if that is something of
Yeah.
significance, how can they still, communicate that in their application? Because I do think
I
for many of us, it is pretty important.
I think that is truly a brilliant question, Neil, and I think it's something that I think students are kind of wrestling with that right now, whether it's applying to med school or applying from high school to college. I mean, I think there are just a lot of those internal, and obviously the internal pressures for people to wonder, well, should I not, et cetera. And so I get that. And what I would say, and this is what I say to every student, irrespective of identity or inner sections of identity, is that I think it I think it would be I think it would be disingenuous for us to pretend that who we are as human beings and our environment has not in any way influenced our path. And so when I talk about, mission alignment and really thinking about the entirety of a candidate's story, I think to the extent that you have your identities, your various identities have impacted, influenced by way of
Mm.
your storytelling, the places in the world you visited. Dina, it was interesting seeing and listening to all the work this organization has done, not just here, but abroad. So I don't think that's something you need to hold back on. I can't imagine that that's not influenced how you've thought about healthcare and caring for community and caring for communities and meeting communities where they are. So I hope that's helpful, Neil. I don't know if
No,
that's helpful for you in your own
no,
reflections.
definitely.
Applying to med school, the amount of reflection I think that's required to put together a really solidly kind of credible application so that when I read Neil's application, I feel like I really want to meet you. I want to meet you anyway. I'm meeting you
Thank you.
virtually, but right, and that I want to know more about you, more about your story. And that's kind of that's what you're trying to evoke, right? In
Mhm.
terms of your own personal, when you're kind of sharing your own personal narrative as part of the greater application. So I hope that's helpful
Yeah. No,
in
no,
your own reflections. Yeah.
yeah, definitely is
Hmm.
helpful. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Neil.
Awesome. Sarah, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Willies-Jacobo. Thank you so much for your time. I had
Absolutely.
a specific question about the activity sections. I keep hearing mixed opinions about whether it should be like a personal anecdote and then like a takeaway, or if it's just can be like for the short ones, like more just straight up, like I did this, I did that, and that's what my role entailed.
Yeah, great question. So, for the parts of those experiences where you want to be kind of the most reflective and perhaps the most thorough will be in the first three meaningful ones,
Okay.
right? So the three meaningful ones, when we read those, we're really trying to capture what it is or was about those experiences that were really meaningful. I think the others, depending on the how involved you were, then I think it's just fine to write a couple sentences about the kinds of work you were engaged in. I hope that's helpful, Sarah.
Yeah, yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question.
We have a question in the chat from Bushra. Are there any specific qualities or factors that admissions especially keeps in mind when reviewing applications from non-traditional students? So students transitioning from maybe a different career and
Yeah.
going into medicine.
I think that's such a great question. And, about a third, 25% to, 33 or so percent of our, I think, enrolled student body, or maybe a little higher. I think it's 36% of our enrolled student body are non-traditional students. And so I think a couple things. If you are changing careers, you're a career changer. For us, it's always important to understand what the change is about. So, for example, we have students who, did work in healthcare, but were more on the nursing end. I think we've got like 3 to 4 nurses, former nurses at the school. We've got people who were engineers, and so we welcome non-traditional students. I think people who've had a different career and are now coming to medicine. We have had teachers bring a really distinct perspective and a different type of kind of energy to the space, which is really, really good and rich for engagement and teaching and learning. If you are someone who you've been out for any number of reasons, it could be caring for an ill family member. It could be that your journey is just a little bit slower and you're perhaps engaging in more volunteerism or service or what have you, getting yourself ready for medical school. That's fine too. I think the most important thing for us to understand, so for the career changer, what is the career change about? That's important. If you're someone who took several gap or growth years, understanding what you were doing in between the time you finished college and you're applying to med school is going to be important to get to. So I think those are going to be the important non-traditional pieces. If you're a reapplicant, in addition to all the rest, one of the added pieces of information we encourage students to share with us is kind of that reflective process of what not getting into med school may have felt like and how it informed how you're now going through the journey. So have you had the opportunity to, kind of relook at your application and see where some of the gaps may have been? Have you, spoken to others about, what things what elements of your application may need a little bit more work? So I think a lot of what we're looking for is kind of the gap parts and what was happening there, and for career changers, the impetus for moving from nursing to doctoring, or from moving from engineering to doctoring. So I hope that makes sense.
That was super helpful. Thank you.
Bushra, great, absolutely. Thanks for the question.
There's another question in the chat on gap years. Is there anything specific admissions officers look for in students' gap years, mostly in terms of their activities? And when I think of gap years, I also am curious, how important are update letters, especially in
Yeah.
gap year when you're doing things throughout the year?
Yeah, I think that's another wonderful question. So the most important thing, and the gap year was initially coined because students were often filling a gap in their application. And I think we now know that there are many, many reasons students are not going directly from college to medical school. So now we're kind of recoining them as growth years. So within those growth years, I think it's identifying kind of the reasons for it, which is great. I mean, some students will say, look, I need to work for 2 years and make money before I start medical school. And that's perfectly fine if that's the thing that you're doing. Other students may say, look, during undergrad, I really didn't have the time to engage in a whole bunch of clinical stuff. So that's what I'm doing. So we are not prescriptive with what students should utilize that time for. We definitely leave it entirely up to the individual. If you've spent a year and a half, 2 years traveling, that's very interesting. And we would definitely want to learn more about some of your own learnings during that time. So.
Awesome. We have time for one more question. We
Great.
have one in the chat from Alex. It seems like life's challenges are brought up numerous times in an application. How should applicants avoid redundancy when other impactful experiences, the personal statement, and secondaries all ask about it? For example, medical problems were a large challenge, but also an impetus to becoming a doctor. Should that be mentioned in all of those places?
Yeah, great question. And that's such a good point, because I think many, many parts of the application can have some redundancies in that way. So I think it's just a matter of not necessarily saying everything in the same way verbatim. So the impactful experiences section is not that long, so you can kind of go through more of a very brief description of what the health issues were. And then it really is in your personal narrative where you can do a lot more unpacking and a lot more reflecting in real time, kind of the impact, since you've said that it absolutely, Alex, has had an impact on your desire to pursue medicine. So it really is in the personal narrative where you can do a lot more in terms of reflecting and writing and talking through what that experience was actually like.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I would also then follow up with, I've had multiple people have had similar talk to me about where they want to keep something for a secondary, for example,
Yeah.
put it in their personal statement, despite it being an important part, just to avoid that redundancy. Do you think then if something is important to both essays, there is going to be some necessary
Absolutely. That's how I see it, because you are not, until you look at the secondary, or maybe if you go to studentdoctor.net and you kind of see what their secondary questions are, say post it for all schools. I never know how they get them, but it's always there. So, a lot of students will start writing their secondaries before anyway. Because it really just depends on what you're being asked. A lot of the essay questions on, or whatever the prompts are on the secondary application, are again more asking how you align with the school more so than you telling your story. So I would say that you really, really want to try to ensure that your personal statement on the primary application is as rich as possible. And then there may be areas that you repeat, and that's okay. That's perfectly okay.
Okay, that's very useful. Thank you. Because I think I was about to
Yeah.
exclude some stuff from my personal statement to
Yeah.
say.
Don't hold back. Don't hold
Okay.
back. If it really, really informed your journey, you absolutely want it in there. Don't hold back.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Great question. Thank you, Alex.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for joining tonight. And thank you, Dr. Willies-Jacobo, again for your time. Such a pleasure getting to know you. And we would love to collaborate more in the future, with you and NAAMA NextGen. So very excited for that. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you all. Great questions. It was truly a privilege. I really enjoyed this and hope to see at least some of you sometime soon. Be well. Take good care. Bye bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.